Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have a privilege of speaking with Dr. Peter Cappelli, one of the world's foremost experts on human resources and workforce management. As George W. Taylor Professor of Management at the Wharton School and the Director of Wharton Center for Human Resources, he brings decades of insights to our conversation. As a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources, he is recognized as one of the top 5 most influential management thinkers globally. His expertise spans performance management, agile organizational systems, and strategic hiring practices areas where he has shaped policy and practice through roles including senior advisor to Bahrain's employment policy, distinguished scholar at Singapore's Ministry of Manpower, and co-director of the US Department of Education's National Center on the Educational Quality of the Workforce. His thought leadership reaches broad audiences through regular contributions to the Wall Street Journal, a monthly column in HR Executive, and featured articles in the Harvard Business Review. He has been recognized by NPR as one of the 50 influencers in aging and received the 2009 PRO Award from the International Association of Corporate and Professional Recruiters. Dr. Cappelli earned his BS in Industrial Relations from Cornell University, his DPhil in Labor Economics from Newfield College, Oxford University, and received an honorary doctorate from the University of Liège, Belgium. In today's episode, Dr. Peter Cappelli shares key insights from his acclaimed work, Our Least Important Asset, Why the Relentless Focus on Finance and Accounting is Made for Business and Employees, a book that challenges how we think about corporate priorities. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Peter Cappelli to the conversation. Dr. Peter, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us.
Good. Thank you, Deepak. My pleasure to be here.
Professor, your book's title is provocatively ironic. You argue that despite a century of research proving the value of investing in people, organizations systematically treat employees as their least important asset. What led you to investigate this contradiction, and what were the most surprising findings in your research?
The title, creating titles is a long process of sort of trial and error. U.S. corporate executives used to say, people are our most important asset all the time. They were mocked for saying that, and I think they've stopped saying it, but people who are a little older will know that phrase, people are our most important asset all the time. And so the title of this book, you're right, is supposed to be ironic. It's our least important asset. And I got to that conclusion writing this book. And, people who write books will all know this, people who don't might not, that you never know exactly where the book is going until you get in the middle of writing it. You sometimes hear novelists talk about this, and I never believed what they said. They said the character takes over and the book goes this way. Well, what happens is that you discover after you start writing that you see things that you didn't know before. And in this case, I started to write a very different book. And the book that I was going to write was about basically just describing how we actually manage employees as opposed to what the textbooks say. So the textbooks, particularly about human resource management, really feel like we're still in the 1950s. And the 1950s was the era of the great corporations, big employers that employed lots of people for life. And they had all these practices to hire carefully and to train and develop people and manage their careers over a lifetime. And the textbooks still have that feel to them. There was an entire industry built up around that, a field of industrial psychology in particular, built these tests on selection, built tests on how to predict who will advance and develop, and all the systems for doing that. The problem is we don't do much of any of those anymore. So what I started to do when I was writing each chapter, how do we hire, how do we train people, is that you could see little bits of the old framework still around, but it was as if we had taken all the meat off of them. And you could see it in practice by practice, about training, particularly about hiring. How do we actually do these things? And hiring in particular in the US, what you see is we focus relentlessly on the cost per position to fill and the time to fill those positions. Those are the two big things. We don't look at whether we're getting quality employees or not. We don't measure the outcome that you would think is most important. And this is so bizarre that I started to think, why would this be the case? And similarly with training, similarly with development, similarly with topics like layoffs, why do we do these things? They just don't seem to make sense. And there's one other issue too, and that is in business schools, management, human resource programs around the world, including in India. What you see is that we constantly tell new managers and students, you should be investing in your employees, you should be hiring carefully, you should be managing people appropriately, and it doesn't happen. And we kept basically just saying that somehow they're not listening to us. And the story is, it's not that they're not listening to us. They don't care. They hear it, but they don't care. So there are reasons and incentives built into the current way companies operate which caused them to be on this path. So some of your listeners may know a very famous argument made in the late 1950s, 1960 by a guy named Douglas McGregor. And he described the world as he saw it being divided into two camps. There was one camp of managers who did something that he described as Theory X. Theory X meant we believe people are basically lazy. You have to manage them, monitor them carefully, big incentives, big punishments. That's how you manage people. And the other, which was called Theory Y, is we understand that people are not like that. That modern psychology has taught us that people have needs of various kinds. If you meet those needs, they will perform better. And we saw this march through time toward Theory X, Theory Y rather, away from Theory X through the 1980s. And then it started to reverse. And now we're on this Theory X path. So the book is really documenting that and explaining why this is happening.
Professor, you identify financial accounting standards as a primary driver of poor people management decisions. Can you
Yeah.
explain how the quirky way financial accounting treats human capital, where employees cannot be considered assets because
Yeah.
they are not owned, fundamentally distorts organizational strategy and decision making?
Yes, right. So I think this is a US phenomenon for sure. If you to look at US companies and you say, what is so different about them now compared to a generation or so ago? If you walked into corporate headquarters, and I'm old enough that I did this, in the 1980s or so, you would have seen lavish and plush facilities. Once you moved up the towers, and you got to the top floor, it was always where the executives were. The carpets were thick, the artwork was expensive, everything was quiet, and that's all gone you know. And some of this is cost cutting as well. And the reason we have cost cutting is because of the growing influence of investors. And investors were important in the US in business 100 years ago, and they would be on the boards of directors. And then they sort of disappeared. And we had in the 1950s, the leaders of boards would be the people who ran the companies. So the CEO, of course, would be there, but also several top executives would be board members. Maybe you'd have one or two people from outside. What you see now is many more outsiders, but particularly more investors. And the idea developed, really, it was a theory that began in business schools and eventually took over, that the purpose of a corporation is not to balance the interest of stakeholders. We used to teach you have employees, you have customers, you have the community around you, and you have investors. You have to balance those interests if you're the CEO. All gone. And the story now is you have one stakeholder, It's the investors. That's what you're paying your time and attention doing. As investors become more important, the world of finance becomes more important. And let me just say a word about that in a minute. But one more thing about India, since you're in India. We wrote a book a few years ago called The India Way, talking about how the largest Indian companies, anyway, operate. And you didn't really see this same story in India, partly because investors were not as important. Banks were important in terms of financing companies, but governance was not driven by investors. And Indian companies, as a result, operated and still do, I think, quite differently than US companies do. But in the US, investors drive everything. What do investors care about? Well, they're keeping score as to how companies are doing. And the way they do that is rules set by financial accounting. So if you think about a game like football, soccer, or cricket, and you say, how do you play these games? How do you decide who wins? There's a series of rules that tell you here's how the game has to be played, and particularly, here is how we keep score. Financial accounting is how investors keep score. And financial accounting is quirky. It is strange in lots of ways. It is not built by business people. It was built by accountants and to some extent by investors. So not by people who run companies, right? And it is very inflexible. It is inflexible on purpose, the same way rules of sports are inflexible. You can't have people changing the rules in the middle of the game, even in the middle of a season. And here are the quirky assumptions of financial accounting. One is, as you said, the idea of what is an asset. So if you talk about sports, you would say the assets are the players. And if you were talking about companies, many companies used to say people are our most important assets, right? And the reality in financial accounting is, as you say, people cannot be assets, employees cannot be assets. It's a little different outside the US, but in the US, if you look as an accountant at a professional sports team, you would say there's no value there, really. Say, why not? People come to watch us play, and what they watch are the players play the game. The players are under contract to us. We got great players. That's why we make money. Yeah, but you don't own the players. And something can only be an asset if it is owned. So you got lots of great players on your team. So what? There can't be assets, no value there. Bang. Why does that matter? Well, when we start thinking about how we acquire people, we have an executive we want to acquire, we pay a big bonus to acquire them. If we're acquiring a physical asset, we can count that as an asset on our balance sheet, but also we can depreciate it. That means we don't have to pay off the big bonus to get an executive to come in 1 year because that executive is going to be here for a while, like a piece of equipment. We can pay it off slowly. You can't do that with spending on people. You have to pay it off as soon as you get them. Training, right? We talk about training being investment in people. If it's an investment in equipment, again, you can depreciate, pay it off slowly. When it comes to people, you can't do that because they're not assets. Training is not an investment. In financial accounting, it occupies a weird position of administrative and operating expenses. You can't even see it on financial accounting forms. It's just lumped in with coffee you spend on office stuff. So it looks like you're wasting money if you're spending money on training. And there are other weird things. One of them is we measure performance of companies on a per employee basis, not a per worker basis. So what does that mean? That means if I can cut my headcount, suddenly my company looks more valuable because we've cut the denominator, right? You measure it per employee. And I can cut my headcount of employees by bringing in workers from someplace else, certainly by outsourcing work, but also taking in people who are actually employed by a leasing company, employee leasing, or a temp agency. So a big move in tech companies, which started more recently, US big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, those, about half of their workers are contractors. Why do they do that? Cuts their headcount and suddenly their company becomes more valuable. It also explains strange things why we have moved so quickly away from pensions. Pensions make perfect sense for employees because employees are risk averse. We want to know that we will get a pension in the future. It will pay this amount. Okay. Um, we have moved away from that toward defined contribution plans, which basically say we're pushing the risk onto you, right? We're going to make a donation to your retirement, you manage it, and good luck, right? No certainty. All the risk is pushed onto you. Why do we do that? Because in financial accounting, pensions are a liability. They're a huge liability. They sit on your balance sheet as liabilities and make you less valuable. Contributions once a year, even if it's the same amount, are are expenses, right? But they're not liabilities that sit on your balance sheet. So why do we get rid of pensions? Because of the quirkiness of financial accounting. So, this is not things that make sense economically. So if you took an economics class, and part of the problem we had is lots of people took elementary economics classes in college who were taught that, look, firms have an incentive to be profitable, and that means they will be cost minimizers because otherwise, somebody else will be more profitable and take their business away. But profit is not simply revenue minus expenses. Profit is something that accountants spend their life worrying about. And a dollar of cost is not a dollar equally. It depends where it is in your operations, right? And it could be more efficient for you to spend a dollar on employees. However, it might be more profitable for you to put that dollar into a piece of software or put a dollar into an outsourcer who will do the work for you.
Professor, you write that shareholder value offers no guidance on whether it's better to treat employees well or squeeze them for short-term gains.
Yeah.
How has the dominance of shareholder value maximization operationalized through financial accounting
Yeah.
transformed HR from a strategic function into a cost minimization exercise?
Right. So this, shareholder maximization is what you hear every CEO say. And by the way, this was one of the big differences between US and Indian companies, which was quite striking, right? When we talk to CEOs of Indian companies, and we talk to the CEOs of the 140 biggest companies in India, for our book on India, and you talk to them about what's the company about, they always had a social purpose. Now, you might argue whether they actually meant that or not, but a social purpose is a very powerful way to motivate people, right? To say we're going to bank the unbanked, right? As ICICI Bank used to say years ago, or, we're going to bring healthcare to the masses. If you tell people, on the other hand, that our social purpose is to make other people rich, it's not very motivating, right? Our goal here is to return big value to shareholders and make them wealthy. It's hard to get behind that issue. So if we say, look, our goal is to maximize shareholder value, the other problem is it doesn't tell you anything about how you're supposed to do that, right? But financial accounting seems to give you guidance. And financial accounting says um, squeeze costs down as much as possible because that is the scorecard that we use to say how well you're doing, right? And financial accounting is all about the cost side. The revenue side, we can't be sure about, right? So, if we bring in new employees who are quite expensive and say, look, they're going to guide the company in the future in a big way, investors say, I don't see this as helping at all. It's driving your costs up, and you're making us a claim about what will happen in the future to revenues. And we got no reason to believe that that's true. You're probably making this up. In many cases, they are making it up. They don't know. So the guidance that shareholder value provides is always about cutting, 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 cutting. And you see this right now with the AI boom, right? So you say, what is the AI boom about? Why are investors so keen on this? And the reason is because they believe that AI is going to allow companies to cut headcount. And that will make the companies far more profitable, right? So they believe, look, this is really a bet on the ability to shrink costs. It's not a bet, they don't think necessarily, that will allow companies to do new things or do things better. It is a bet about cutting costs. And that's why it has driven the markets in part so high. And that is why, at least in the US right now, we see this very peculiar situation where CEOs are desperate because their boards are hitting them, because the investors are hitting the boards, to show that they are cutting headcount with AI. We have to show that it's working. So they make a lot of claims about what's happening. And the evidence for the claims, as far as I can tell, and looking carefully at this, you don't see much evidence that it's true.
Professor, your book exposes how unlimited vacation policies weren't actually designed to help employees, but to eliminate paid time off liabilities from
Yeah.
balance sheets. Can you
Yeah.
walk us through this example of how financial accounting logic produces policies that appear employee friendly but actually serve financial reporting objectives?
Yeah, so this idea of unlimited vacations started in Silicon Valley, and there's a reason why these things often start there. They start in new companies that often are growing really quickly. They're making tons of money in the software world, um, where margins are very high if you're successful, anyway. And you can also get away with a lot of things, right? Now, the companies often are run by entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs often are people who have no prior management experience. Sometimes they may have business experience, but often they're tech people. And you might say this is interesting because you get a lot of new ideas coming up, but most new ideas are wrong. And you can see if you look at a company like Microsoft, which began at a point when Wharton first had contact with him on the education training side. They were already the world's biggest company in terms of market cap. They weren't doing hardly any training. They had no professional human resources at all. And you look at them now as a much bigger company, but much more sophisticated company. They have world-class management practices, world-class human resource practices, right? They grew up, right? So in Silicon Valley, this idea of unlimited vacations started. And to some extent, it might have been driven by what we're also hearing from Silicon Valley now, this 996 story. I don't know if you guys have heard this from China. It's a miserable idea that you should be working from 9 in the morning to 9 at night, and you should be working 6 days a week, right? And if you're an entrepreneur and this is your company, you probably are working that way. You're really all in because the rewards are enormous. If you're a regular employee, you're probably saying, why on earth would I want to do this? If the company succeeds, you know, in a big way, maybe I could buy a house, maybe. Probably I can just buy a car. It's not like I can retire, right? So this 996 sort of idea of being all in, part of the culture at some places. And the idea was people will only take time off if they really need it. So let's just let them take off whatever time they want. But behind the scenes, they also understood the accountants, and it's not like accountants elsewhere didn't know this either, but they just weren't likely to be able to pull it off. Um, the way vacation time works in most companies, bigger companies, is that you earn it, right? So it is accrued, earned, and basically you're kind of paying it off through your performance. If you stay longer, you earn more days off. And if you don't use them, and in the US, employees on average don't use all their vacation time, one of the reasons why is because the company owes it to you. When you leave, they pay you for your vacation time that you didn't use. It is something that you kind of own. Because you own it, it's a liability on the balance sheets. So what the 10 companies said was, let's just let employees take whatever they want in terms of vacation time. And that means for us, no accrued benefit, no liability on our balance sheets. Suddenly, our companies are much more valuable because all those liabilities disappear, and poof, we're suddenly more valuable. Now, the reality of this, do employees get to take off whatever time they want? Of course not, right? Your boss, even if you have a formal policy that you can, quote, do it, your boss, nothing prevents your boss from telling you, look, we really can't let you go now. And if you go and take this break now, it will hurt you in your promotion prospects or in your end of the year performance appraisal, or everybody in the office will go, oh, Deepak is leaving now. God, can you wait and do it? Nothing prevents that. So the idea of an employee-friendly policy here is how it was sold, and the people who were introducing it were telling the public, investors too, everybody that's what they're doing. But the real reason was it's just moving what was a liability and moving it off your books.
Professor, chapter 5 of your book, How Work Gets Done, describes the rolling back of successful practices like lean production and agile management that empowered employees with decisions returning to engineers and optimization experts. How did these evidence-based approaches that transform manufacturing and knowledge work get abandoned and what replaced them?
Yeah, so the second part of the book, maybe it should have just been a second book. It'd be simpler. The other thing I saw going on is this return to this theory X view of thinking, right? And theory X is what you would get if you took an engineering class about operations. And understandably, they are thinking about optimization of materials and optimization of performance. And, that you need to make some assumptions in order to get answers with those practices. If you apply those tools to people, you get theory X. And this was laid out initially by Frederick Winslow Taylor, who had a long association with the Wharton School, where I obviously sit. And his initial research was much of it funded by Joseph Wharton, who was the CEO of Bethlehem Steel, big steel company, founded the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, right? So the way they think about employees is as physical assets, although not the way accountants think them, right? And they think, as you might with supply chains and physical materials, we should minimize the use of those, which is not crazy to think about that. Um, but the way you do that is to think about optimization. So I'll give you an example. Um, let's think about how workers are scheduled. So let's say, for example, that we have normal working hours, but occasionally we have to work longer, or we might have a shift work. One shift operates into the evening. How do we decide who works those shifts? Well, you have kind of two approaches. One approach is to go to the software, linear programming software does this, and we're going to allocate people to time slots optimally. Means everybody gets the same amount of work, right? And you could know maybe in advance what it's going to be. And bang, 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 you get the schedule. Here it is, right? Another way you could do it understands that people's human needs are quite different. People get sick. People sometimes have crises in their lives. And sometimes these days, which are assigned to them randomly, are really, really costly to them. So another way you could do it is that you could have the team itself allocate the work and the schedules. That is, we sit down and we say, okay, who can do Wednesday? Maybe what's your first choice, second choice? And once the schedule is set, or you could even start with a set schedule from the software, and then say, okay, you guys adjust it. And so what we do is basically an exchange of favors. I can't work this Wednesday. Can somebody cover for me? Great. If you cover for me on Wednesday, I can cover this other day. And you let the team negotiate and work it out themselves. You put the parameters around, which means it's got to be covered. We have to have people cover all these days. You guys should try to be fair, but you work out what is fair, right? And it could be that it works out over time. Um, the Theory X approach says don't ever do that. Don't ever allow the employees to do it. They can't do better than optimal. So let's just impose the optimal solution. And so what we have seen is growing increase of optimal scheduling, that is allowing software to do it rather than employees to do it. Lean production is maybe the most interesting because starting about a generation or two ago now, in the 1980s, we started to realize that the scientific management practices in manufacturing had terrible quality. And the quality had to do with humans. And one approach would be to say, okay, we're going to get rid of humans, put in place robots. General Motors and some of the biggest auto companies tried to do this initially. And one of the things they discovered was that robots are very precise, but when they break, it's not just that robot stops. Everything has to stop. You can't just pop a replacement robot in there. And if you have a series of robots, even if the odds of each of them individually breaking are small, you only have to have one broke, and then the whole thing stops, right? Um, so that's one approach. The other approach was to look to see what happened in Japan and Japanese management practices, which basically empowered employees to take control over quality issues. So rather than the way things used to work, we'd have an assembly line, we'd tell people exactly what to do, treat them like robots, bang, 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 bang. And then at the end, we would have quality people who would look for the problems and try to fix them. Right? One of the things they did is get rid of the quality people altogether and make every person responsible. So we will see if there are quality problems and they point to you and why don't you fix this? We're going to let you figure out how to make the process better. And we went from quality circles, which just dealt with quality issues, eventually to lean production, which said we're going to deal with quality and productivity issues, and we're going to make the team responsible for how to get better quality. Ultimately, in software, this went to agile systems, where they let them even figure out what the solutions would be to the basic problem we're trying to solve with our products. So push it on to employees and let them figure out how to do it. What I'm seeing anyway now is a lot of effort to take this back, take control back from employees, rather than let the employees figure out in lean production the best way to perform tasks. They've brought back engineers, and now they have cameras that are monitoring you, looking at your hand movements and things. Rather than having the team do it, now some engineer at a vendor someplace else is going to tell you how to move your hands, right? And the reason why, it will be optimal. The problem with being optimal is if employees hate it, it's no longer optimal, right? Because there are lots of ways employees can help you or hurt you, right? If they want to be helpful, they can fix things, they can point out problems before they become a big issue. If they don't want to help you, they just ignore those things. And whenever a discretion is required, they don't use it to help you, just hurts you, right? So I'm seeing a move away from employee engagement, employee help toward bringing in the cameras, bringing in the software, bringing in the engineers again to tell employees how to behave. It's not that there's evidence this is better. It is simply ideology. If you were brought up with that operations research mindset and you didn't learn anything about people or management, then this is the way you think about problems. And we're seeing more of that because more leaders have that engineering background And we've gotten rid of management development, where we used to, in the great corporations, take engineers out of college and put them through extensive management courses that lasted years to teach you how to actually manage people. Those are gone. So what do you get instead? You get the engineering view. Nothing wrong with being an engineer. That approach is absolutely important. But by itself, when you start dealing with humans, the training teaches you nothing about humans. We got a problem.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You call HR the last line of defense against the dehumanization of work and urge
Uh-huh.
HR professionals to push back against CFO-driven cost minimization.
Yeah, yeah,
What specific action can CHROs take to quantify the hidden cost of poor people management, advocate for sustainable practices, and
yeah,
reclaim HR's original mission of employee advocacy in this hostile accounting environment?
yeah. Well, I think, at least in the US, and unfortunately for those of you in other countries, the US story gets enormous amounts of attention. Some of this is because it's the biggest economy in the world still, and multinational companies, many of them are based in the US and they're less than spread around the world. Media is largely based in the US more than anywhere else. So the stories from the US move around the world, right? And we have this particular US business environment, which not every place else has. But I think the idea is that it is important for people in human resources to understand the game that leaders are playing, and particularly the role of investors, right? And the way to appeal to them is not to say that you should ignore investors and ignore the financial accounting world. You're not going to get anywhere with that, right? Um, I think the way to do it is to understand how you can make progress by talking to them about those issues. And those issues are the costs that they are not seeing. So the biggest one of these is turnover costs. So, turnover is expensive to employers. And the more careful studies show it is bigger a lot than we think, even than people in human resources think. So when they're talking about turnover costs, they're often just counting the administrative expenses associated with bringing a new person in, which don't count at all the costs of that person leaving, getting the new person up to speed, the disruptions of the group, etc. There's a fascinating study done by one of my colleagues who looks at even in a store, retail environment, what are the biggest costs of turnover? Well, it turns out what they discover is the biggest costs of turnover are the disruptions, even in a retail environment, to the people around. Some of that has to do with the recruiting side. So we bring in new candidates to look at, and we show them around the store, and we ask other employees to spend time talking to them or show them how things work. Well, you start totaling that up with high turnover, it's really expensive. CFOs, and I know this for a fact because I've run this experiment to talk to them, they have no idea what turnover costs are. Unfortunately, HR people have no idea either, and that's unconscionable. I mean, you really should know. And don't take the accountant's word for the costs. You have to look at things like how long does it take a new hire to get up to speed and perform as well as a currently employed person? That's where the biggest costs are. And on hiring, it's not the administrative costs of taking somebody that you've offered a job to and getting them on board. It is finding that person in the first place. What's the cost of hiring a bad person? If you hire somebody, they don't work out, what are those costs? If you make mistakes, all those have to be factored in, and you discover that turnover costs are enormous. Now, the CFO does not care that much about that, but the CEO does. And the reason the CFOs don't is their job is more to talk to the investor community. They do care about costs, right? But they care the most about costs which are easier to count. But the CEO cares about all operating costs. And you have to talk to them about that. Is training a cost? Yes, it is. but employees who are trained perform much better. And how much better? You need to be able to show them. There's evidence on all these things. What happens when you leave positions vacant? So you see in the US, we see this all the time now. Everybody in HR knows you get permission to hire, you think, and then you found a candidate, you want to hire them, and then you can't get the budget to hire them. Or they say, not this quarter, let's drag it out for another quarter or so, because it looks to the CFO like this saves you money, right? But in fact, the evidence is there, if you look at it, that performance falls in way you can see in financial accounting, in terms of outcomes if you leave positions vacant, right? So a lot of the things that we see happening now, because financial accounting seems to suggest they work, like don't fill vacancies, which is happening all the time now, right? In fact, it's costly. The problem is the CEO doesn't think it's costly because the CFO is telling him this saves money. Unless you can see the other side of it, that's what you believe. So we have to come armed to the CEO and say, you don't have to go to battle with the CFO. You just have to say, here are costs. You should just see these because I know you're not seeing them at all. You wouldn't see them, but we can see them. Here's what these things cost. Are we factoring this in? Now, it will be a slow argument because they don't want to believe it. But you have to demonstrate these costs, right? And that's the first step. If we don't have that, there's no way you're going to make progress, right? You'll just get to where we're seeing in the US, which everything is just cut, cut, cut. Cut headcount, move jobs out to somebody else, cut hiring costs, don't worry about bad hires, don't train people, somehow just churn them through until we find people who can do it. It's a terrible way to run a ship, as it were, but that's what we're doing.
Professor Peter Cappelli, thank you for helping us to understand how financial accounting has shaped and often constrained our approach to people management. Your mission and message is clear. Organizations must look beyond quarterly earnings and balance sheet metrics to truly manage their most valuable resource. We are grateful for your research, your advocacy for employees, and your challenge to HR professionals to reclaim their role as agent of positive change. Thank you once again.
Thank you. My pleasure.